Hello, wealth tycoons. During the year 1908, a 10-year-old boy's whole life changed. He felt the thrill, the energy, and the speed all at the same time as he watched a race. He made up his mind right then that he would be the one driving one day. But it was just a dream at the time. He didn't go to school very often and came from a poor family. In that area, his dad worked as a blacksmith. Back then, only rich people could follow their dreams. In 39 years, his name would be linked to speed, power, and money. He didn't know it. This is how the son of a poor blacksmith became the man who made Ferrari possible. Want to know who he is and how he made things possible for himself? Stay with us till the end to find out. Let's get started. The year is 1898 and the place is Modena, Italy. Because the weather was so bad when Enzo was born, his father couldn't even write down the event until 2 days later. That's why his birth certificate has the wrong date. As kids, they didn't have much, but things weren't always bad. He worked on cars in his dad's shed for a long time. Enzo loved learning to drive because he helped out. As he got older, he became more and more interested in cars. He didn't go to school very often, but he did learn things from his dad's job. When World War I started, things got worse. It looked like bad luck came at once for Enzo's family. Both his older brother and father were sent to fight in the war and never came back alive. They both died in 1916, when the Spanish flu killed a lot of people. It hurt more than just losing his family. The family business also didn't do well. He finally got a job with the troops as a blacksmith, but he still got the flu. It happened to him in 1918, and he almost died. Even though he got better, the service had to let him go because he was in such bad health. Enzo was in a tough spot because he didn't have his family, the blacksmith business, or much of an education anymore. He really needed to find work, so he moved to the city and looked for jobs that involved cars, which was his one true love. He tried to work for many companies, even Fiat, but was turned down every time. It looked like nothing would go right for him until he finally got lucky. He was hired as a test driver by CMN, a company that turned trucks into cars. Things began to get better for Enzo when people saw how good he was at what he did. Enzo was only a test driver at first, but quickly things changed. He was hired as a full-time race car driver and goes to events for his company. In 1919, he got his big race start at the Parma Poggio Hill climb race. A lot of people were shocked when he came in fourth. His year was full of races, and he ran in more of them, but things didn't always go well. He had to drop out of some races because of issues with his fuel tank and other issues. This made it hard for him to repeat his first race success. But Enzo never liked to chill out. He set high goals for himself and was always going after more. He quit CMN and went to work for Alfa Romeo, which was the best Italian race car company at the time. At Alfa Romeo, he had both good and bad times. Enzo worked hard when he was young and motivated, and it paid off. In 1923, he won his first Grand Prix at Ravenna's Circuito del Savio. People know this track for having a lot of tough races. He was happy to have won the race, but he didn't stop there. In 1924, Enzo kept winning races and became a well-known name in the racing world. It didn't matter how well Enzo did, he couldn't avoid some harsh facts. In those days, driving a race car meant constantly risking your life. Along with his rise to fame, 2 other drivers he had driven against died in accidents that same year. Even though it hurt a lot, Enzo kept going, even though it was clear that he was different. Over the next few years, he didn't seem to be as driven. Some people thought it was because he had a child and his views on life changed. Some people thought he felt too bad about the deaths of his fellow drivers. Enzo had driven in 41 Grand Prix events and won 11, which was a big deal no matter what the reason was. That's not something many people would be proud of. Even after he stopped racing, he couldn't fully give up the sport. He stayed with Alfa Romeo and helped run the company and make new cars from the inside. Enzo didn't like doing things the way most people do them. He pushed for many changes that would make cars and racing better because he had big plans. One of the most amazing things he did was put together the first race team for Alfa Romeo. It had some of the best drivers of the time. The first racing team for Alfa Romeo was called Scuderia Ferrari, which means Ferrari Stable. The name came from Enzo Ferrari, who was already getting more attention because of how famous he was becoming. Countess Baracca, a very important backer, said something that was one of the most important things for Ferrari as a brand. She was the mother of Francesco Baracca, a skilled fighter jet pilot who died in World War I. Francesco's plane had a prancing horse sign on it, which the Countess gave to Enzo because she thought Enzo was a great racer. Enzo took this sign and turned it into the logo for Scuderia Ferrari. He added a yellow background because that's the color of Modena, where he was born. That's how the famous Ferrari logo came to be. The Alfa Romeo symbol was changed to this sign on the team's cars. It's even more interesting that Porsche was also using the prancing horse at the same time as Ferrari. But Ferrari is the one that really made a name for itself with it. Even so, things were hard for the team. Alfa Romeo, who had been their biggest fan, ran into money problems in 1933 and stopped sponsoring them. Ferrari's team had a hard time getting new backers without the help. In 1935, they did beat the German-dominated teams, which was a big deal because their cars were so advanced. But by 1937, the team was too weak to keep going and broke up. Enzo went back to work for Alfa Romeo, where he was the manager of a new race team that they were trying to start. This brand new team, Alfa Corse, didn't do well and didn't last long. The executive director of Alfa Romeo and Enzo had a fight. Enzo is known for having a strong will. After he was fired, Alfa Romeo gave him a lot of money and made him sign a deal that said he couldn't work for anyone else for 4 years. During that time, he couldn't race or build race cars under his own name. Enzo had no choice but to go along with it. That being said, Enzo was smart. He took advantage of a weakness in the deal to start his own business, Auto Avio Costruzioni. This business made parts for cars, and Enzo designed cars for other drivers. He was able to follow his racing dream without breaking the contract. Even though he was limited, things were looking good for him until 1939, when they changed again. When World War II broke out on September 1st, 1939, it wasn't just soldiers marching off to war. The whole world was on fire. Spain joined the war, and Enzo Ferrari, along with many other people, was caught up in it. Spain was ruled by Mussolini at the time. Enzo wasn't like most Italian guys, though. Big ideas, fast cars, and an unquenchable drive were all things that man had. But because the world was in chaos, things got hard for him too. Enzo wasn't forced to join the military, but you can imagine how strange it would have been to see him in a uniform. His factory had been making parts for cars, but it had to change gears and start making things for the war. Talk about a side trip. But Enzo was a smart businessman, so he wasn't going to let something like a global conflict stop him totally. He saw a chance in every turn and twist. He didn't just stay out of sight, he made friends with some important politicians who could help him stay alive. He even became a member of the Nazi Party. He did go to their events dressed as a Nazi because he had to in order to stay alive. There were some good things about this move too. He got some lucrative government contracts that kept his business going, while many others were having trouble. Things weren't perfect, but they were easy to deal with. Then though, the Allies showed up, or rather, they bombed. They went after his plant because they thought it was useful for the military and destroyed it. Not Enzo. Most people would have been crushed when they saw their life's work turned into a pancake. Not at all. His mind was on other things when the bomb went off. He didn't dwell on what happened. Instead, he packed up and moved his business from Modena to Maranello. It was all part of the plan to start over in a new place. Enzo did what he had to do to stay alive during this time. In order to keep his ties to the Nazi government, he played a very tricky game. In reality, he was working with the Parisian freedom fighters. Being on edge was dangerous, and someone eventually put a reward on his head. But Enzo didn't move, even though his life was in danger. He had been through worse, and this was just another problem to solve. He avoided several attempts to kill him by both the government and the resistance, and he even paid off the person who put the price on his head in the first place. How smooth is that? Even though many companies had been destroyed or hurt by the war's end, Ferrari rose from the ashes. By 1946, Enzo's plant was back up and running, and the following year, he was making his own cars again under the Ferrari name. He had made cars for Alfa Romeo, but these were his own cars. For Ferrari, it was the start of their rise to the top of the racing world. Enzo didn't want to just make cars, though. He also wanted to show that they were the best. He put his Ferrari cars up against Alfa Romeo cars on the tracks, of course. Also, guess what? Their first big win was in 1949, and they kept getting wins after that. Every time Enzo won, he made history and left a memory in his own name. He was no longer just a guy who made cars. But racing doesn't come cheap. Ferrari has to spend a lot of money on study and engineering to stay ahead of the pack. Even though Enzo loved winning, He couldn't ignore the fact that the company was having a hard time making money. He chose to sell racing cars to the public because he was a sensible person. After all, who wouldn't want to own a Ferrari? It wasn't long before these sleek, powerful machines were sold out everywhere. Ferrari cars were, and still are, fashion and speed stars. But Enzo wasn't done yet. Even though Ferrari was successful, he was still hungry for win. He was hungry for more speed, wins, and fame. That unwavering drive, however, came with risks. One of Ferrari's cars was in a terrible accident in 1957. As the race was going on, one of the tires blew out, and the car crashed, killing 11 people. The driver, co-driver, and 9 onlookers, 5 of whom were children. It was a terrible accident, and both Enzo and the tire company were charged with murder. Even though the hearing went on for a long time, Enzo was finally found not guilty in 1961. He was free after the court case, but he had scars on his body. He couldn't get off track, though. He got back into racing and even backed a new motorsports magazine called Auto Sprint, because he didn't like how the media talked about racing. His best years were the 1950s and 1960s, when he had a lot of magazine pieces, features, and wins. The good times couldn't last forever, though. Things began to change in 1962. It was always Enzo's strength that he was tough, but sometimes it was also his weakness. He was demanding and wouldn't give in, which made it hard to work with him. It got so bad that important people on his team quit after a fight with him, which became known as the Great Walkout. His stubbornness got him through wars and attempts on his life, but it now caused problems when things were calm. Enzo Ferrari is still a hero, though. He fought through some of the hardest things that life could throw at him, like 2 world wars, attempts on his life, and court cases, and still won. He made a name for himself and his race team that is still the best in the world. Even though he had bad times, one thing we know for sure about Enzo is that he never gave up on his dream of making the fastest cars in the world, not even during the worst times of war or the worst crashes. He tells Ferrari that his wife will be a boss there. There were 9 of his top workers who didn't like that. They were the smartest people in the company and worked on the business, marketing, and engineering sides. Not just any workers. These were the kind of people you don't want to lose if you run a car company. What did they do? They asked for Enzo's ruling to be overturned. They all left, 9 of them, when Enzo wouldn't move. There was a fight, and they left. They also started their own company to compete with Ferrari in races. If you lose your best employees in that way, you must be freaking out, right? If they were Enzo, most people would have freaked out. But not him. Not at all. He always did what he thought was right. And if other people didn't like it, that was their problem. Instead of being angry, he saw it as a chance. Over the next year or so, he hired a lot of new people and promoted people from within the company. What do you think? Not only were these newbies good, they were great. They took the lead and helped make some of Ferrari's most famous cars. In the end, that big walkout that seemed like a bad thing, at first turned out to be a good thing. But of course, Enzo's life wasn't all sunshine and race cars. At the same time, rumors began to spread about how tough he was on his race drivers. Enzo believed that people should always try to go faster and be better, pushing them past their limits. He was a tough coach who always put his drivers up against each other in practice to push them to do better on the track. Some people began to think that he might be trying too hard. 4 of Enzo's drivers died in just 2 years, which was a bad turn of events. Their deaths weren't caused by bad cars or anything like that, but reports spread that Enzo's strict training methods were to blame. Some people told him that he was giving up too much to be fast. People began to use the phrase, "success paid for in blood," which was very bad for Enzo's case. Yet Enzo had more than one problem to deal with. A lot of big names have been crossed off his list over the years. The first one is Henry Ford II, which is the same as the first one. The story of how Ford tried to buy Ferrari will be told in a bit. Then there was Ferruccio Lamborghini, who was famous for making cars, who was mad at Enzo and chose to make cars himself to show he was better. Also, don't forget Carroll Shelby. He wasn't really a fan of Enzo either. All of these guys had deep-seated grudges against Enzo, and they all made cars, or in the case of Lamborghini, whole companies, just to beat him. One heck of a competition. The stress of driver deaths, feuding CEOs, and business fights began to hurt Ferrari. The business wasn't doing very well financially. It wasn't easy to sell more sports cars to fix things because of new safety rules for cars. Even though Enzo knew he needed a business partner, he wasn't ready to give up control of the racing area, which he loved. That's where Henry Ford II comes back in. Ford was ready to spend a lot of money to work with Ferrari, but there was a catch. Enzo couldn't go through with the deal because Ford wanted a say in the race. At the last minute, talks broke down. Fiat stepped in and saved the day for Enzo. It's funny because Fiat was the same company that turned Enzo down for a job the first time he applied. After all these years, they were finally ready to work together on his terms. The two companies joined forces in 1965, but Enzo still owned more shares. After a few years in 1969, he sold more shares to Fiat, which made the deal fair for both companies. With that large sum of money, Enzo worked on a side project, making cheaper sports cars called Dino, which was named after his son who had died of a muscle disease when he was only 25 years old. Now, Enzo had another son, but this one was from a relationship with his lover. He didn't talk about this son in public until after his wife died, and that son still owns 10% of Ferrari stock today. Do you want to talk about family drama? At the end of his life, Enzo stopped dealing with money issues and only focused on racing. Ferrari's race team never quite got back to being as good as it used to be, but Enzo still got to celebrate the company's 40th anniversary. He passed away in 1988 when he was 90 years old. But Enzo was Enzo, so even his death had a bit of style. He asked that the news not be released for 2 days to keep people thinking. Classy. What is your key takeaway from Enzo's story? Share with us in the comment section below. If you enjoyed watching the video, do not forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel.